behalf of Gary O'Neill, Oklahoma State Conservationist for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, I'd like to thank you for your time. My name is Mike Sams, the State Biologist for NRCS, and we come to you today to talk about a proposed wetland restoration project. The proposed project is located in Grant County in north central Oklahoma, immediately west of the town of Medford. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, we must conduct an environmental evaluation for our federal actions to determine if there are significant and extraordinary circumstances. During our environmental evaluation, we noted extraordinary circumstances, namely the Medford Municipal Airport, in relation to the location of our proposed projects, which would serve to attract migratory waterfowl. So through that, we've determined that we need to conduct an environmental assessment. The environmental assessment process begins with this presentation, where we seek public and agency information and comments pertaining to the proposed project. This is known as the scoping process and will be open through March 30th. After that, we will take that information and those comments and integrate them into a draft environmental assessment. We'll release this draft environmental assessment for a 30-day public review and comment period as well. We're hoping that that will be out in mid-May. After that comment period is closed and we have time to evaluate those comments, we will integrate those into a final EA and make a final decision. That too will be out on a 30-day review. So for this process and for future reviews, you can comment to me directly at the email below, or at the end of this slideshow, we will give you a physical address if you want to send it in a hard copy format. Before we talk about specifics of the project, we wanted to give you a little background into wetland restoration under NRCS authority. The 2014 Farm Bill developed the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program termed ACEP. It was reauthorized in 2018. A component of ACEP is the Wetland Reserve Easement, or WRE. It is through WRE that we can work with willing landowners to restore manipulated, altered, or destroyed wetlands and protect them via conservation easement. The purpose of WRE is to restore, protect, and enhance wetlands on eligible private or tribal lands while maximizing wildlife habitat benefits and other wetland functions and values. Those wetland functions and values, aside from those habitat benefits, include protection and improvement of water quality, attenuation of floodwater, recharge of groundwater, protection and enhancement of open space and aesthetic qualities, carbon sequestration, protection of the nation's flora and fauna, and contributions to education. Now, the definition for wetland restoration per ACEP policy is quite lengthy, as you can tell from the screen, but it really boils down to two options. The first being that we restore to the original vegetative community and hydrology to the extent practicable. The other option hinges back to one of those objectives where we maximize wildlife potential. And the option gives us the opportunity to substantially replace the original habitat functions to benefit migratory waterfowl, or to replace them to benefit species listed as needing conservation innovation through the State Wildlife Action Plan. Now, to assure that state-specific guidelines for WRE align with conservation priorities, we solicit input from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation to develop ranking criteria and establish priority conservation regions across the state. If you look at the map to your right, you'll notice that the highlighted yellow area is the mixed grass prairie and is currently one of those priority conservation regions that we've established. After establishing these ranking criteria and priorities, we present them to the State Technical Committee for their approval. We also invite U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Wildlife Department to make site visits with us to those that have applied for the program to ensure eligibility and discuss restoration alternatives and the likelihood of successful restoration. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also participate in the ranking process where we award scores relative to the environmental benefits. These scores are compiled across the state, at which we select those rated highest for funding. If you remember, one of the definitions within restoration includes enhancing habitat for species identified in State Wildlife Action Plan. For Oklahoma, this is the Oklahoma Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation Strategy. It establishes priority landscapes within each ecoregion and identifies species of concern that would benefit from conservation. For our priority area, the mixed grass prairie region, it shouldn't be surprising that herbaceous wetland is a high priority conservation landscape and one that we want to emphasize within WRE because it stands to benefit a number of species of concern. Now that gives you some background information on how WRE applications are ranked and ultimately selected for funding. Now let's look at some specifics around the project and the potential alternatives. For the purposes of the environmental assessment, we established 3 alternatives plus a no action alternative. With regard to wetland restoration and protection, the no action alternative and Alternative 1 are similar in that they only seek to protect existing wetlands with no net increase in wetland habitat. Alternative 2, on the other hand, looks to restore wetlands to their original form, function, and capacity to the nearest extent practicable, which would result in approximately 15 additional acres of herbaceous wetland. Alternative 3, on the other hand, seeks to enhance habitats beyond their original capacity, namely by increasing their size, to benefit migratory waterfowl and species of special concern identified in the State Wildlife Action Plan, which would result in approximately 43 acres of additional herbaceous wetland habitat. This project involves 2 properties that are somewhat unique in the manipulations that's taken place, plus the restoration potential. So let's look at them separately, and let's start with the north property. If we look at the north property, at least 2/3 of it still remain in active agriculture production. If we look at wetland manipulations that's taken place, probably the most prominent is a drainage ditch that was installed in the early 1940s. This drainage ditch effectively reroutes hydrology and dewaters wetlands that would otherwise be there. When we look at potential wetland depressions that are throughout this field, we see an increase in sediment load and a reduction in their capacity to hold water. This reduction is a result in 2 parts. One, by the repeated cultivation which gradually fills these depressions, and the second culprit would be an increase in flooding that has deposited sediment in the bottom of these wetland depressions, again reducing their capacity. And staying with the north property, let's look at some of the alternatives that are available under the environmental assessment. And first would be the no action alternative, where we're just simply looking at protecting the existing wetlands that are out there and allowing that cropland to go through natural succession and just revegetate on its own. Alternative 1 would be much the same in that we would protect existing wetlands, but we would effort to plant that cropland to native prairie and facilitate prescribed burn to maintain the health and vigor of that prairie system. In addition, we would also make an effort to control the erosion that's occurring along that drainage ditch that is impacting Osage Creek with increased sediment loading. Alternative 2, much the same, would restore prairie, would protect existing habitat, but we'd also look at restoring wetlands, and namely we would plug that the drainage ditch and allow hydrology to take its natural course from the northeast down to the southwest. Now, because that course involves movement of water off area, we would have to do some kind of a catchment basin or enhancement of a wetland to capture some of that water, so we did not impact off site. So alternative 3, much the same, but that enhancement, that catchment basin would be considerably larger. That wetland restoration footprint would be considerably larger to support those wildlife benefits. And this is what that restoration would look like under alternative 3, which would be naturally our preferred alternative, provided it doesn't provide adverse impacts. This is an engineering drawing of that alternative 3, our preferred alternative. Of special note is not all of that basin is water, for one, and 2 is the depths of water that occur across this basin. These are shallow wetlands that we expect will dry up annually, and it's that wet-dry cycle that we're trying to replicate and provide habitat for wetland-dependent species. So one thing to bear in mind as we go through this process, these wetlands are not ponds or not reservoirs. They are shallow water features that are expected to dry up annually, and quite honestly, given the climatic conditions of this region, may go several years without having any water capacity within them. So let's take a look at the south property now. And you'll note that there's still a considerable amount of wetland habitat that's naturally occurring out there, and certainly some of that we want to protect. But as we look across this, we notice depressions that have subsequently been filled with sediment. That sediment likely resulting from that increased flooding and that repeated cultivation. So no longer do these depressional wetlands have the capacity that they once had. We also see some evidence of ditching as well, but on a scale, these is fairly minor compared to that north property. So the restoration alternatives for the south property closely mirror those of the north property, in that the no action alternative and the alternative 1 look only to preserve existing wetlands. Alternative 1 looks to increase the extent of native vegetation on the area by promoting prescribed fire and other management techniques. Alternative 2, similar to that of the north property, looks to reestablish existing depressional wetlands to their original capacity. Alternative 3, again similar to the north property, we're looking to enhance those habitats, namely by increasing their size to provide herbaceous wetlands for waterfowl and species of concern under the State Wildlife Action Plan. This is an outline of what wetland restoration would look like under Alternative 3 with regard to size and location. And here again is the engineering drawings with regard to Alternative 3, the enhancement of wetlands. You'll note that not only do we show the outline of where they're at, but we also denote depth. And once again, these are going to be really shallow wetlands. The dark blue color represents less than 3 foot deep. So again, we expect these areas to dry out annually and may even be dry for extended periods of time depending on weather events. So we're really trying to replicate that shallow water herbaceous wetland community that's so valuable for waterfowl and species of special concern. So just a quick recap of the 3 alternatives plus the no action with regard to wetland restoration and preservation. The no action and the alternative 1 would be just protecting existing wetlands with no net increase in acres. Alternative 2 would be restoring wetland acres and to the tune of approximately 15 additional acres. Now alternative 3 would be an enhancement of those acres and would result in additional 43 acres of wetland habitat on these areas. The reason why we're pointing out wetland acres and habitat is because this is kind of the driving factor of attracting waterfowl and other avian species within close proximity to an airport. So this will be the focus of our analysis. So let's take a quick overview of what that analysis looks like. So once again, the extraordinary circumstance that really is driving this environmental assessment is the location of our conservation efforts in relation to an airport. And that airport is the Medford Municipal Airport. It has runway dimensions of approximately 3,000 feet by 60 feet, and it's oriented north and south. According to airnav.com, there's 5 aircraft based on the field, and they're all single-engine airplanes. Flight operations average approximately 83 per month, and most of that is local general aviation. There are a couple of guiding documents that we'll use to evaluate our potential impact with regard to our conservation efforts on aircraft safety. And one of those is a Memorandum of Agreement between several federal agencies that recognize the risk wildlife pose to aircraft. Within this document, it outlines not only where airports should be built in relation to threats, but also the location of threats in relation to airports. A companion document to the Memorandum of Agreement is this advisory circular produced by the Federal Aviation Administration. Let's take a closer look at both of these documents and how they relate to the potential impacts our conservation efforts pose. So that Memorandum of Agreement, by which USDA was part of, is quite lengthy, but there's certain aspects of that that I think is important that we pull out and make you aware of. The first being that even though the memorandum focuses on airport expansion and location, there is a portion of it that talks specifically about conservation and mitigation habitats, by which is what we are actually attempting to do. So our activities fit within the umbrella of this Memorandum of Agreement. Additionally, it points to some citing criteria, again, within that FAA advisory circular, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the next slide. Another important contention in the Memorandum of Agreement is that despite their agreement of looking closer at the impacts that location of conservation habitats might have on airport safety, is that we still actively encourage and support wetland restoration. So that can't be overlooked in our analysis. Now, the FAA Advisory Circular establishes 3 citing criteria. And by citing criteria, what they're looking at is the distance between the airport and potential wildlife attractant. In our instance, would be the wetlands that we're proposing. The first 2 of those citing criteria deal with the aircraft that are serviced by that airport. The first being piston-powered aircraft, and their recommended distance between the attractant and the airport being 5,000 feet. For turbine-powered aircraft, that distance recommended is 10,000 feet. Our proposed projects are over 10,000 feet from the Medford Municipal Airport. Now, the third citing criteria deals with the approach and departure airspace, and they recommend a 5-mile separation if that wildlife attractant causes hazardous movement across that approach and departure airspace. It is here that we will focus our analysis. To be able to evaluate our potential impact, we needed to have a better understanding of bird movement in the local landscape around the Medford Municipal Airport. To do so, we conducted avian census and surveys. Our airport census involved parking along the county road adjacent to the airport windsock. We would make counts from 30 minutes after sunrise, and we would count all birds that we saw crossing the runway or the pattern. We did this bi-weekly from November of 2017 through March of 2018. This is the peak period by which we see wintering waterfowl in the local landscape. This is the result of our airport census. Over the course of 10 census periods, we counted, on average, over 300 birds that crossed the runway and/or flight pattern during that 30 minutes immediately following sunrise. Most of those observations involved blackbirds and starlings, pigeons and dove, which moved in a predicted direction from west to east in the morning, as if they were roosting immediately west of the airport and heading east to forage in town. In our census, we noted 4 species or groupings of species that would be attracted to wetland habitat. Those included geese, a killdeer, great blue heron, and a duck. Geese were the most prominent observed, and they moved in a fairly predictable pattern from east to west. This pattern was due to large reservoirs that were located east of Medford, by which geese concentrated on. Let's take a closer look at how these species might relate back to our conservation efforts by creating additional wetland acres. Let's start with geese. The agriculture within the local landscape attracts and provides forage for a large number of wintering geese. After foraging bouts within the local crop fields, geese seek out open water habitats for roosting and loafing. They prefer these sites as they afford better detection of predators. The wetlands that we're proposing are largely herbaceous and do not afford this type of habitat. Therefore, we do not expect a positive or negative effect of our creation of wetlands on movement of geese within the local landscape. During our later censuses, we started recording killdeer at the airport. Now, while killdeer are a wetland species, they're not wetland obligates and often occupy other environments, including airports. Those individuals that we observed appeared to be establishing nesting territory in the gravel surrounding the airport's windsock. We do not anticipate our proposed wetland restorations to affect the movement of killdeer within the local landscape. During the 10 surveys, we had 1 sighting each of a great blue heron and a duck. The heron appeared to flush from a pond that's located on the golf course immediately adjacent to the airport, while the duck appeared to be a transient and was flying at rather high altitude. We supplemented our airport census with a roadside survey. Immediately after the census, we drove a route that passed by several wetlands that were somewhat indicative of what we proposed. The intent of the survey was to see if the census corresponded with what we saw with regard to occupation of wetland species on wetland habitats within the local landscape. During these 10 roadside surveys, we observed 121 ducks and 6 great blue herons. No other wetland-dependent bird species were observed. You may have noticed our wetland surveys were skewed west of the airport. One reason for this is that is where most of the wetland habitat occurs within that 5-mile buffer. By and large, those habitats indicative of what we are proposing lie adjacent to Osage Creek. It is noteworthy that when ducks flushed during a roadside count, they tended to fly westward or in a north and south direction along Osage Creek. That concludes our presentation, and I would like to thank you for your time. If you would like to send comments or additional information that might be helpful in our assessment, you can do so by emailing me directly at michael.sams@usda.gov, or you can send via mail at the address below. Thank you.